Welcome to this learning series about the citizen in the democracy by the Shalom Hartman Institute. I'm Meirav Jones, and I'm going to offer a perspective on the question, when I act politically as a citizen of the democracy, who or what am I? When I make political decisions, when I vote or protest, when I initiate or participate in political action, who do I act as? Here, speaking as part of a series in the Shalom Hartman Institute, I'm asking this question as a Jew for a Jewish audience. As a political theorist, what I am offering is, I believe, one way of navigating some serious dilemmas of contemporary political life that Jewish thought might open up. The question of who we are as citizens is a relatively new question, certainly for Jews. For centuries, Jews weren't citizens. They were special subjects, they were outcasts, they were exiles. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 may be the most famous Jewish expulsion of the pre-modern world, but Jews were expelled from England in 1290 and from France in 1306, and these expulsions were no less constitutive of modernity. In fact, at the founding moment of the modern state and the modern world of states, the founders of modern sovereignty defended the fact that Jews weren't citizens. Jean Bodin, the father of modern sovereignty, wrote that the Jews brought the hatred of other nations upon themselves by adhering to strange religion. Thomas Hobbes, considered a foundational theorist of the modern state, reminded his readers that the Jewish religion was the only religion not tolerated in the Roman Commonwealth, because Jewish religion is incompatible with civil government. Even at the onset of modernity then, at the Westphalian moment that followed the breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire and established the modern world of states, the Jews were not and could not be citizens. There was no hurry among political theorists to include Jews. Oliver Cromwell debated the reintroduction to England just after Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, the text in which that quote was from. And James Harrington, at the moment Cromwell was debating about the reintroduction of Jews to England, James Harrington, a famous Republican political theorist, wrote that the Jews, if not given their own land and reintroduced to England, and that's a different story about the Jews being given their own land as an idea of the 17th century, but if we reintroduce the Jews to England, they will suck out the lifeblood that would otherwise sustain a useful member. So, the arguments that worked to reintroduce Jews to England were actually messianic arguments rather than theoretical arguments. And when Jewish presence became a norm in Europe, first under the radar, Jews were still not citizens. When Jews eventually were given citizenship in the Emancipation, they were told who to act as. So the question of who they were when they acted politically, who they should be, was not a question for them to answer. They were to be Frenchmen and set aside their Jewishness. This was something 17th century theorists couldn't even have thought possible, that Jewishness was somehow separate and separable from the Jew. Hannah Arendt laments what emancipation should have been and wasn't, the admission of Jews as Jews to the ranks of humanity. In the Jew as Pariah, a hidden tradition, she describes how the Jews, unemancipated for centuries, and even in modernity and even in the Enlightenment, turned to the emancipation of hearts and minds and became what Max Weber termed a pariah people. In fact, the Jews made the pariah into a type. They survived spiritually, somewhat ironically, as outsiders to the political and material, some making this spiritual existence an ideal, with the dependence on these outsider Jews. Outsider Jews would depend on collaborated Jews with connections in high places for sustenance, giving them an illusion of some sort of insiderness, but they weren't citizens as Jews, not even the collaborators. We don't live today in Arendt's world, neither in the world that she described, nor in the world that she lived, and we're no longer a pariah people en masse. Jews participate in politics as citizens, and where they want to, they participate as citizens and as Jews in democratic states. All this introduction was to ask, what type of people are we when we participate in politics? This question, as I implied earlier, is a question of political theory, and there are two standard answers into which I want to intervene. The first is the liberal answer. If I mentioned Thomas Hobbes earlier, though he wasn't a liberal in his politics, we might look to his famous State of Nature for laying the foundations for liberal decision-making. Or we might take this to John Locke or to John Rawls' Veil of Ignorance. The liberal answer is that when we make critical political decisions, we should do so from a neutral standpoint, from imagining ourselves in a pre-political, pre-cultural, pre-religious situation, and formulating political decisions from this standpoint. I should ask myself when making a political decision, what would be just if I didn't know anything about my present circumstances? If I didn't know whether I was a Jew or an immigrant, how would I vote? Which laws would I want to see legislated? How would I configure society? If all I knew were the bare facts of life. The idea is that from a neutral position, where all people are free and equal individuals, consensus can be reached on important things. And truly important things, life and human needs, will be defended first and with a broad consensus. If I extend this to civic action in a democracy, I should act as a free and equal individual whose loyalties are chosen. The fact that I am Jewish should be irrelevant to the causes I choose to stand up for. I should stand up for injustice because no one would want to live in an unjust society. I should stand against discrimination because I could have been the person discriminated against. I will act against things that a bare human would consider unjust and promote things a bare human would recognize as valuable. Freedom, for example, property, and certainly life. While there's much to be commended here, there have been arguments that this isn't enough, and that what I'm protecting ultimately, if I conduct civil life through this principle of liberal neutrality, is the bare person, whose essence is a free choosing individual. But is this enough? Another critique of liberalism and the liberal standpoint is that it diminishes difference, which is an essential aspect of social life. And in its erasure of difference, it's imperialist in the guise of neutrality. I don't want to take a harsh critique. I don't want to present a harsh critique on liberalism, particularly when I want to advocate freedom, equality, and choice. But what I will say is that I don't think it's possible to truly neutralize oneself for the purpose of political decision-making. So there's an authenticity problem inherent in the liberal approach. And further, if it's not possible, and if there's going to be an authenticity problem, do we want this liberal neutrality as our ideal for political action? I can also say that by the middle of the 20th century, liberalism itself was seen as having brought about totalitarianism by creating a vacuum, as mere life wasn't valuable enough. And the fact that free and equal individuals consented to political structures didn't give them inherent meaning or value. I think we can see a shadow of this, if not more, in the polarized political world in which we live today. Here we come to another standard approach to who we are when we act politically, and this is the nationalist answer rather than the individualist answer. We are members of a nation. We act as parts of a group or parts of a greater whole, where the whole is not the whole of humanity, but the whole of a particular nation. If we act as part of the French nation or as part of the German nation, we consider ourselves parts of a higher end, a greater being, and a singular higher end that defines our being. If we act as a citizen of the American nation, all other affiliations are secondary. If I act as part of the Jewish nation, here too, other affiliations are subordinate. With the nationalist meaning of the self, when I act politically, I don't act to protect bare life, but to protect the nation that sustains me, that generates culture, religion, and language, and through that, to protect a rich version of myself. Taken to a totalitarian extreme, however, nationalism can come at a high cost. When the self is defined through a greater entity that it serves, that entity can be overly demanding. It may not be moral or attain morality. It may demand sacrifice. It may cause tremendous suffering and stand unchecked by individuals who, had they understood themselves as separate individual or persons, they could critique or change it. During the Second World War, and particularly in seeking an adequate response to the Holocaust, Catholic theologians introduced a third approach to who we are in the world, into the world of political ideas. And this is the idea of the person. This was intended to intervene in this dichotomy between the bare self versus seeing the self as significant only as part of a greater whole, subordinated to a higher end. The person in this third Catholic conception is an individual who is not bare life, but body and soul, an end in himself with a direct connection to God. The person is created in the image of God, and the politics of the person is the politics that acts to protect persons, to grant them rights that would allow people not only to survive, but to live in dignity and connection with God. It was through this idea of the person that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was conceived and became international law. And this you can actually read more about in Samuel Moyn's book, Christian Human Rights, which I highly recommend. I want to suggest here that this third alternative, the person who is an end in himself and has a direct connection to God, resonates with Judaism, but is incomplete. And we have resources in Jewish thought to complete it in a way that might be appealing in our deeply divided political reality. On one hand, Adam shenivra b'tzelem, man created in the image of God, written into the human rights law, partly because the Tzelem Elohim of Jews was desecrated to such an extent in the Holocaust, is an important intervention into political thought coming from Catholicism. It's also an important approach to the Jew, expressed in a language shared with Judaism. On the other hand, a direct connection to God is not enough to characterize a person. This spiritual life, essential to and exhaustive of personhood in the Catholic conception, could leave the Jew, or any person characterized as such, as a pariah, as an outsider from political life, who turns to the spiritual and the natural as an alternative to being an active citizen. And this can even become an ideal, as it did for many Jews in the past who were denied the possibility of citizenship. I may even go so far as to claim that if we accept this characterization of the person characterized by a direct connection to God, it could be an impediment to civic action. I would argue that to act as citizens, to act politically in a democracy, we need a richer notion of the person, still with a direct connection to God or to the spiritual, but also connected to the world. And I believe that as Jews, we have this conception of a person in our reflections on the history of Jews. And in our sources, we're encouraged to use these reflections in our civic action. The injunction to love the stranger because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt can be read as an injunction to generalize from our experience as people, from our history and from how events affected us, to how we approach politics that touches not only on ourselves, but on others. Our history as persons is not only Jewish history, and this is actually part of what it means to be a Jew. Jews have always been a hybrid people, by virtue of not living in their own state, perhaps, and not having themselves congruous with any one political nation, while still being part of the Jewish nation. Our history as persons is a complex history of multiple ties that each of us holds and that each of us holds uniquely. This is increasingly true not only of Jews, but of people in general, with the world seeing larger number of migrants nowadays than ever before. In this complex hybrid identity, I can appreciate that as a person, I may be a Jew by birth or by choice, from a particular place, with the relations to other Jews and non-Jews, and with a relationship or an approach to the state of Israel. At the same time, I may be a vegetarian for particular reasons related to my inner self and my exposure to facts in the world, with relationships to both vegetarians and meat eaters as individuals and groups. I may have one or more passports of countries that I may or may not live in. I may be an immigrant with relationships to other immigrants, and also with relationships to people who have never lived in more than one language or setting or country. I may be a student or a teacher or both, with relations to others as such. As a person, I have moral convictions that stem from how I, with my particular experiences over time, interacted with the values I learned. This complex understanding of the person comes from a hybrid personal history so typical of the Jews that translates to what it means to me to be a citizen in a democracy. So when I, Meirav, sit at a table to deliberate nationalism and binationalism with Israelis and Palestinians, I bring my personal history and my convictions with me. I do this consciously, recognizing the privilege of being able to be a whole person and a citizen engaged in political action. I also recognize this personhood in others, that each person with whom I deliberate brings their own person, their chosen and unchosen affiliations, their personality and their history to the table. We don't deliberate on justice from an abstract position. We know that we have not always been free and equal, and that some of what binds us are things we have not chosen. Yet as persons, we have choice and are connected by this. We also know that our identities are not summarized by our membership in a particular nation. We meet as particular persons, grounded in our personal histories and circumstances, and sharing a human need to be citizens as persons. This same idea guides me, Meirav, when I protest. It guides me when I teach, when I ask my students to bring their whole selves to that little box on the screen, or hopefully someday to the classroom. Together, we create an authentic society of citizen learners, recognizing each other as persons and learning from how other persons, truly other, respond to ideas. It is through these authentic personal interactions that we create democratic deliberation. When we try to turn off aspects of people, which happens in academia as in political life, when we say, you can be here in this discussion of Black Lives Matter or of Palestinian rights, but you can't be here as a Jew. When we accept this, we're accepting damage not only to ourselves as persons, but we're acknowledging that this is a price that we and others should be prepared to pay as citizens in a democracy. I don't think it is, or that it should be. The fact that Jews were denied the possibility of acting politically as Jews and citizens for centuries and now have the opportunity to do so should encourage us to reflect on our responsibility in today's political reality and on how, by acting as the persons we are, we can contribute to the diversity of discourse, not only by opening up Jewish perspectives, but perspectives of all the persons who may otherwise be marginalized or have aspects of themselves turned off. Thank you.